welcome back, everyone. Hope you're enjoying today's first day of the symposium. We had a fantastic talk with keynote speaker, Dr. John Howard, director of NIOSH, and then a really great panel discussion on COVID impact in industry and organizations. So obviously, COVID is in our mind front and center, day in and day out, and has been for months, right? But we know still during this time, in addition to the things that we've seen with COVID, that traditional occupational safety and health concerns are still there. They haven't gone away. Some of them maybe have risen to prominence and elevated in a sense, but others taken a step back and the attention perhaps has not been there. So that's something we have to keep in mind. And so in this regard, we're really pleased and excited to have our pilot project research training program grant recipients chat with us today about their projects. So, and I didn't mention in the beginning, my apologies. I'm John Staley. I direct outreach and continuing education with the North Carolina Occupational Safety and Health Education Research Center. And part of our activities with our ERC and other ERCs regionally and across the nation is that we fund pilot projects to encourage faculty to develop projects in occupational safety and health to intersect with the NORA, the National Occupational Research Agenda. So with that in mind, what I'll do is give a little bit of background with the plan here. Each pilot project recipient will chat for about 5 minutes on their project. You should have already been able to, hopefully you've reviewed their slides and background about each of their projects. So we'll go sequentially in line for 5 minutes for each, and then have about 30 minutes for open question and answer. So the first speaker today is Dr. Cheryl Dean Witt, and she is an assistant professor at the University of Louisville School of Nursing. She continues to use her 30 years of nursing experience, love of farm families, and concern of health disparities in rural and Appalachian areas to pursue her research interests, particularly of improving physical and mental health of farmers and farm families. And she will be chatting today about female farm operators' mental health in her pilot study. So Dr. Dean Witt.
Thank you. Hello. I'm not seeing my slides. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to be able to present my pilot study investigating the mental health of female farm operators. Next slide, please. I also need to thank the Southeast Agricultural Health and Injury Prevention Center for funding this project. Next slide. The purposes for this study are listed here. The overall goal of this study was to be able to provide more information about the mental health of women who operate farms. Next slide. This audience is well aware of the alarming rates of depression and suicide in our production farmers in the U.S. and again, worldwide. There are factors that are unique to the occupation of farming that contribute to these high rates of stress and depression. And in addition to increased rates of suicide, increased levels of depression and depressive symptoms and stress can also increase that farmer's risk for injury and increase their risk for the development of chronic diseases. And all of these can impact the farmers and farm families' quality of life. Now, research about these depressive rates among our farmers has come to the forefront, but the majority of these studies are largely focused on men who operate farms, despite the 1.2 million female producers in the United States. Next slide. So why should we even explore women as a different population group? Well, men and women respond differently to stress. And then studies show that in the general population, women have higher depressive symptoms than men. And in addition to the stressors associated with farming, women who operate farms may also have additional stress due to their gendered role. Next slide. The methods are as listed here for this cross-sectional multi-method pilot study, and this does also include non-parametric statistical analysis. Next slide. The 13 female farm operators in the study represented 2 geographical areas of Kentucky and 1 area of Tennessee. All of the women were white and all but 1 were married. Their ages range from 28 to 64 with a mean age of 46.7. Next slide. All of the female farm operators in this study reported a great deal of satisfaction from their farm work, and most, 85%, had depressive symptom levels of less than 16, as well as low overall levels of perceived stress. Next slide. I did also find a significant relationship between depressive symptom level and hours performing farm work, where depressive symptom levels decreased as hours performing farm work increased. But there was also a positive relationship noted between depressive symptom level and number of hours working an off-farm job, where levels of depressive symptoms increased as number of farm hours working an off-farm job increased. And there was a significant difference between those women who had an off-farm job and those who did not. Next slide. In addition to the stressors known to be associated with farming, like unpredictability of income, increasing operational costs, the major themes that emerged from the interviews with the farm women, and in order, were lack of respect from male counterparts, lack of physical strength to perform some farm tasks, and multitasking. And the multitasking did include the continuation of the majority of household tasks and childcare, and in some cases, operating the farm and the household tasks were in addition to an off-farm job. Next slide. Without a doubt, the most common theme regarding coping mechanism was faith and prayer. And this was followed by talking with a friend or spouse, and lastly, stopping to regroup or replan. Next slide. All of the women were able to identify when they would seek help for their mental health, and without hesitation stated that they would seek help at this point. Next slide. There were, of course, limitations to the study. They had small sample size. It was a cross-sectional study, which only represents a single moment in time, which could be different depending on the season of the farmer's year. There was underrepresentation of women of color and women without partners, and this limits the generalizability. And then self-reporting of depressive symptoms and stress may be underestimated when self-reported. Next slide. Despite the stressors of being a female farm operator, women in this study who operate farms are very satisfied with their occupation, and they're generally happy people. Next slide. So these results suggest that there's a continued need to study the differences between men who operate farms and women who operate farms. This study also reflects the female farm operators' positive ability to cope with stressors, and potentially a strength-based study to further explore the female's ability to deal with the stressors of farming. It may be needed, and the results could possibly benefit all farm operators. And additionally, the results suggest that interventions aimed at improving or maintaining the mental health of the female farmer could be faith-based or involve some type of social interaction. And next slide, and we are holding questions to the end. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Cheryl. Well, we'll move right along to Dr. Eric Ryan from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Ryan is a colleague of mine, and he shares a passion for the health and safety issues of first responders, specifically firefighters. Dr. Ryan is an associate professor and Stallings Scholar in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at UNC. and Associate Director of the Motion Science Institute. And he's a key member of our NIOSH-funded Targeted Research Training Program for postdoctoral education through our ERC here. And he has a variety, numerous peer-reviewed articles in the areas of acute and chronic stressors, neuromuscular function, occupational performance, and health-related quality of life. So today he will be talking about osteoarthritis prevalence and modifiable risk factors in retired firefighters.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, really excited about the project. This has been a collaborative project we've been discussing among my colleagues for a number of years now. So we have a strong team of folks with expertise in occupational physiology, osteoarthritis, injury epidemiology, and then we are leveraging some expertise also on the West Coast. So we're not the East Coast bias, but we also have that additional reach. We're really fortunate to have strong national and local support through the International Association of Firefighter Chiefs, our North Carolina State Firemen's Association, and obviously we're really excited about the funding from our North Carolina ERC. This project was something we've talked through hallway conversations and at conferences, and we're really excited to move this forward. So using the NIOSH burden need impact methodology, we see about over 30 million Americans have arthritis, and there's a good bit of literature that suggests those that are in high physically demanding occupations have a higher burden. There's only one study that we're aware of that was data was collected before I was born and from the Swedish census. So we felt this was a really novel time to try to identify what is the actual burden of osteoarthritis in this important first responder group. They have a number of potential risk factors that have been linked in osteoarthritis, including high rates of occupational musculoskeletal injuries. They say usually injury of 1 every 8 minutes occurs in firefighters. There is high occupational load. So you can see example here of a firefighter climbing stairs with oftentimes 50 pounds of weight. And then they also have a high prevalence of obesity that's higher than the general public. This is often due to 3 out of 4 firefighters not meeting minimal physical activity guidelines and poor dietary habits. So there is a potential number of risk factors in active firefighters that may influence the increased burden and higher prevalence of osteoarthritis. And then the other part is we want to identify key modifiable risk factors, and not just from the firefighter characteristics or their behaviors, but also some organizational characteristics that we could use to inform future workplace health and safety. So I've been fortunate to work with some great colleagues here, have done a lot of work with retired NFL athletes through our Center for the Study of Retired Athletes. They have a strong history of developing some great health history questionnaires. And so we've used their expertise to put together, develop a survey along with our previous firefighter work. And then prior to deploying the surveys, we reached out to a number of folks across the country, not just North Carolina, but we try to identify folks across the country that have previous experience in firefighter organizations, recently retired folks that head some of their department's health and safety initiatives, some active fire chiefs that are involved in some current high-level organizations. We've also tapped some resources from folks that have headed up some health and wellness initiatives at some larger departments in California. And so we wanted to get a strong feedback from firefighters, given none of us are previous firefighters, and I think it's important to get some of that participatory approach involved with the survey. So we gained their feedback before actually deploying the survey, and we found that to be very helpful. We hypothesized there's some previous literature from some of our group's work with the NFL retirees, where they found that their retired NFL firefighters had a higher OA prevalence than compared to U.S. Males. We anticipate seeing something similar, where retired firefighters would have a higher prevalence of osteoarthritis compared to U.S. males and females. We also anticipate hoping to find some key risk factors that we could highlight for future interventions. For example, we anticipate previous musculoskeletal injury. Obesity would be some of the key worker characteristics. In terms of departmental characteristics, firefighters perhaps that have been involved in departments that have an annual physical employment standard, and then those that have positive health and safety behaviors, for example, positive physical activity, dietary habits, sleep habits may contribute or be possible risk factors that we could use for future intervention. We see the impact being in line with the total worker health approach. So working with John and a number of colleagues in our department here, I've gained a appreciation of using the total worker health. Myself as a physiologist, we oftentimes just look at the mechanism, but I think looking at areas outside of the workforce characteristics, the conditions of work, some of the additional health safety behaviors, we felt like this project would be a great way to help inform more of these total worker health approaches, to develop some policy and programs and practices that may help reduce the prevalence of osteoarthritis and target some of those key risk factors that may be outside just the typical worker characteristics. Thank you for the opportunity, and look forward to taking any questions in the future.
All right. Thanks so much, Eric. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sophie Kay with the Georgia Institute of Technology. And Sophie finished her PhD in 2019 in industrial organizational psychology, and her dissertation focused on the role of emotion and emotion regulation in the workplace in regards to conflict. And prior to her studies at Georgia Tech, she received her BA in psychology with a minor in management in 2014 from the College of New Jersey, graduating magna cum laude, which, unlike me, I was Lordy, how come? Her research is focused on emotional labor and emotional regulation, and she has broad interests into the subjective experience of work and how daily experiences affect motivation, exhaustion, health. And she currently works in industry as a people research scientist at Facebook. Dr. Kay will be sharing with us her work in workplace conflict, emotions, and well-being, a process approach. So, Dr. Kay.
Thank you, John. So hello, my name is Sophie. Again, thank you so much for the introduction. So the work I'm presenting today was my dissertation research, and giant thank you to NIOSH for funding this work. Next slide, please. So stress is expensive, and the annual cost of employee stress, including costs due to absenteeism, reduced productivity, and healthcare costs, has been estimated to be 200 to 350 billion in the United States alone. And conflict is a universal experience and a largely inescapable part of teamwork. And let's be honest, it can also be poorly navigated. So for me, despite being a very agreeable person, there are certainly times where I've had stressful disagreements at work, which has made me feel really stressed and unhappy. So unsurprisingly, there is research in occupational health psychology that has demonstrated that interpersonal conflict is a psychological stressor that leads to strain. So despite all the evidence of straining effects of conflict, as you can see in the slide, relationships to reduce job satisfaction, burnout, insomnia, et cetera, little is known regarding the process of how interpersonal conflict relates to worker well-being. And I would argue this is an important oversight, that without understanding the conflict mechanisms that reduce well-being, we really lack thorough knowledge of what to target in order to minimize the negative effects of conflict. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. John mentioned I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, and my main area of research is on emotions. So most of my graduate work was understanding the emotional experience, emotion regulation, and emotional labor at work. And I've always been interested in improving the employee experience and employee well-being. So in addition to the work that's been done in occupational health psychology on the straining effects of conflict, there's this parallel, highly related, yet not integrated literature on teamwork. And Teams researchers have done an excellent job of studying the process of conflict in detail. And the bulk of this literature really examines two main types of conflict. So task conflict and relationship conflict. And this work shows preliminary evidence that some of the conflict processes can be positive. However, the findings of when conflict is beneficial is inconsistent and has limited application to well-being outcomes. And my study kind of marries these three areas really nicely. Next slide, please. So there was this theoretical paper by Lori Weingart and her colleagues that was published on conflict expressions, and this presented a new perspective in Teams research. And it focused on the expression of conflict in two main dimensions. The first is directness, or how explicitly an opposition is conveyed. The second is intensity, or how strongly opposition is communicated. And I was really interested and I was really drawn to this perspective because it integrated emotion so well, which is something that the Teams research on task and relationship conflict didn't really incorporate well. So based on these two dimensions, directness and intensity, they suggested that high directness, low intensity conflict like debate would lead to both positive and negative emotions and then lead to better performance outcomes. And to my knowledge, these two dimensions, connection to emotion, had not been fully tested before. Next slide, please. So in addition to testing how conflict expressions impacted emotional experience, I extended this model to investigate how conflict related to well-being outcomes and how these relationships might be moderated by emotion regulation. So I did an experience sampling study with full-time workers, and I summarized my findings into three main takeaways. Next slide, please. So generally speaking, conflict expressions did indeed relate to emotional experience. Directness was good, intensity was bad. Both positive and negative emotions related to strain, but negative emotions had a stronger effect. So we do want to reduce those negative emotions as much as possible. And I also found that regulation helped buffer that detrimental impact of negative emotions on well-being. So this would suggest that reappraisal or trying to make yourself feel more positive in those conflict experiences can help buffer the impact on well-being. So based on this, I'd recommend we consider training people on how to better express their conflicts at work and potentially train people to regulate their emotions during conflict. Next slide. That's it. Excited to get your questions. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Sophie. Our next presenter will be Dr. Babak Bazargari, who is an associate professor of biomedical engineering at the University of Kentucky. And he's going to be sharing with us the importance of lower back biomechanics in the experience of occupational low back pain, which I can certainly relate to that. And the title of his presentation today of his pilot project research is Diurnal Work-Related Changes in Mechanical Behavior of Lower Backs Among Nurses. So, Babak. Babak, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Sorry for that. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present our pilot project. Our study is still an ongoing project, and as such, I will be presenting our study protocol today. Our studies of lower back biomechanics are motivated because of the relevance of lower back biomechanics with the experience of low back pain. As you may already know, low back pain is a very prevalent work-related musculoskeletal disorder. Apart from being prevalent disorder, it is also negatively impact quality of life of workers. It is also associated with huge cost. Management of low back pain at workplace has been primarily through management of known risk factor for low back pain. And there is a lot of information about different type of work-related and non-work-related risk factor for low back pain. This approach, however, unfortunately has not been as successful because, as we can see, low back pain continue to remain as a significant work-related musculoskeletal disorders. Therefore, we need to develop alternative approach that target potential root causes of low back pain rather than the risk factors. Among known causal route for low back pain, there is the role of mechanical load. There is extensive evidence that suggests spinal load, forces and deformation experienced inside the spinal column. They can directly or indirectly irritate nerve ending inside the spine column and cause back pain. Understandably, it is not possible to measure spinal load, but with the advances in wearable sensors in measuring body part motion, and also with the advances of computational method, it is possible to get estimates of spinal load using these computational models linked with wearable sensors. Also, it is also possible to get some measures of factors that are directly related to the spinal load, for instance, kinematics and mechanical properties of lower back. However, despite these possibilities, we don't have yet any dose-response relationships between incidence of low back pain at workplace and any of these measures that are related to the spinal load. Therefore, the objective of our pilot project is to establish some evidence, to collect some pilot data in support of existence of a dose-response relationship or a prospective association between measures of spinal load and incidence of low back pain. Also, we are also interested to see if it is just like one-time measure of a spinal load that is associated with incidence of low back pain, or work-related changes in these measures, as work-related changes will reflect also, in addition to influence of work environment, also like some personal factor, for example, like how physical fitness of a worker might influence those changes. The overview of a study is that it is a 6-month longitudinal study. We plan to study 20 nurses, and our study is designed to bring nurses before they start their work shift and run a comprehensive biomechanical study, and then get them back again to the lab and run the same comprehensive biomechanical studies, and also then follow them up monthly for 6 months to document any incidents of back pain that interfere with their job or that cause them to miss a workday. So just briefly go over our biomechanical evaluation. One aspect of lower back biomechanic is the lumbopelvic coordination, or as related to kinematics of lower back. We instrument these nurses with wireless accelerometers that down the road can be replaced with wearable sensors, and we have them to perform some activities, and we characterize different aspects of that lumbopelvic coordination, including magnitude and timing aspects of their movement. For instance, we characterize how their lumbar movement versus pelvis movement is in phase or out of phase when they perform these activities. As related to their mechanical properties of lower back, we have among the tests that we have a sudden perturbation test that enable us to characterize the contribution of volitional muscle activity into the mechanics of lower back. For instance, if a worker is performing a forceful task, how is that going to change the mechanics of lower back? As well as contribution of reflexive muscle response. If they are exposed to a sudden perturbation, how that reflexive response change the mechanics of their lower back. We also have a stress relaxation test that help us characterize viscoelastic behavior of lower back. This is important, for instance, for occupations that involve prolonged posture that are non-neutral. And we can characterize how the stiffness of lower back is changing, or how much energy is dissipated, and using these we can get a comprehensive evaluation of change in lower back mechanical property. And ultimately, we have a computational kinematic driven finite element model of the lower back that we can use this model in combination of wireless sensors to get estimate of muscle force activated to perform certain occupational activity and the resultant spinal load. The status of our study, similar to many other human subject studies, our study was impacted by the COVID-19. Having focus on nurses, it made it a bit more challenging for us during this period. However, we have been able to collect data for 7 subjects, but this data is not sufficient for us to present solid result at this point. Again, when we started this, we had master's student working on the project, but we didn't realize that the COVID may force us to lose some of these students because of graduation. At the moment, we are training new students to continue the study. And with that, I would like to acknowledge the pilot grant we received from UK ERC, and I'd be happy to answer any question at the end.
All right, thanks, Babak. So we'll keep moving here now. Our final presenter of his pilot project research is Dr. Boy Hu from the University of Florida. He is an assistant professor of industrial systems engineering at Florida, and his research has a broad interest in ergonomics, biomechanics, system safety, and human motion analysis. And he received his PhD from West Virginia University in ergonomics in 2016. And he worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health over 2016 to 2018. So, Boy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Okay, so where should I share my, okay. So the title of my presentation today is the effects of AI-enabled autonomous mobile robots on human mental workload and system productivity in smart warehouses. So please, next slide. So a brief background and motivation for this line of research. First of all, it was estimated that over 4 million commercial robots will be introduced in over 50,000 warehouses by the time of 2025. And this estimation was before the pandemic. And I think the ongoing pandemic has fundamentally altered the landscape in this area, and people are utilizing and relying more and more on online shopping and non-contact shopping, etc. So we should expect this number even larger. And in order to fulfill the increasing demands of the fast delivery for online transactions, so those are leading e-commerce giants, they need to build new small-scale, less than 250,000 square foot warehouses that are congested urban locations where the land ability is limited. So on the bottom part of this slide, I show some of the leading giants. So they all have their own highly motivated, large-scale, highly complex infrastructure. But the downside is, first of all, the overhead investment is too high, and they require a huge space, and they work in a human-denied environment. So in the future, in the foreseeable future, we should see a more collaborative human and mobile platform interaction environment. So that is the motivation for this study. Next slide, please. Okay, so the objective of the study is to investigate how AI-enabled, specifically computer vision and autonomous mobile robots affect human performance and mental workload in a smart warehouse setting. And we have we had formulated 2 hypotheses. First one is that autonomous robots can work simultaneously and safely with human workers in close proximity. However, the human workload will slightly increase when working with a robot close by. And second hypothesis was that overall system productivity increases substantially with a noticeable but acceptable performance reduction from the human end. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we had successfully collected 7 participants, and they were all young college students without any experience working in the warehouse industry. And the mobile robot we work with is the Fetch robots, and it is commercial grade mobile robot with over 100 kg payload capacity, and we use a widely adopted autonomous mobile robot control scheme and in our experiment. Okay, and in the test, human workers, participants, they simulate order picking and assembly tasks. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is the scene, working scene we simulated. It is a pretty standard modern smart warehouse worker fulfilling and order picking island. So in the test, the workers, the participants, they simulate the pick orders from the stack and assemble them. And other than, so different, what we do it differently is in the current industry practice, the island is isolated from the robots. The robots cannot enter the space. But in our study, so the robots we deploy can go back and forth around the human and they share the same space. Okay, next slide. And furthermore, this is the part we modify from the real world order picking, because in real world, workers do it for prolonged time, 12 or even 12 or 10 hours per shift. And we do not expect to observe any human error, any substantial human error in 5 or 10 minutes. 10 minutes test. So we make it difficult. The things we can think of is try to pick up different Lego bricks in different colors and different shapes, etc. And independent variables, we have 3 levels of workers working without robots, which was a control condition. Humans working with the empty payload robots, which is the empty platform, and the third one is working with the full payload robots. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of dependent variables, we had pupil diameters measured using eye tracking devices, which is the objective parameter to investigate the human workload, and we had the NASA TLX measured. And in terms of human performance and system productivity, we measured the robot effective travel distance, which is the measure to represent the productivity of the robots. And we investigate the human order picking errors and the task completion time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here comes the results. So to begin with, no human-robot collision occurred during all test trials, which shows the success of our autonomous robot control scheme. In terms of the human workload, and we do observe increase in pupil diameter with the introduction of autonomous robots. But in terms of the subjective evaluation, we do not observe any significant effects of working on the NASA TLX. Okay, next slide, please. Specifically, so if we compare the 3 different modes, only the no robot and full payload robots reveal significant difference. Okay, next slide, please. And in terms of NASA TLX, the sum score, we do not observe any significant difference, and we suspect that because now NASA TLX evaluate the overall performance, and since their primary task was the order picking and assembling, and the influence of the surrounding robots is secondary, so that's the reason we may we do not observe any significant difference. Okay, next slide, please. And in terms of picking error, as I mentioned, working mode had no significant effects on order picking errors, and I think this also this result is well aligned with the current industry practice, because in industry they have multiple way of redundant checking and before they assemble and fulfill the order. So actual error rate is very trivial. In terms of task completion time, by introducing the robot into the shared workspace, human task completion time was negatively impacted, and we observed human workers need to spend more time in fulfilling the same amount of orders. But we gain, the system had experienced and benefited actual gain from the contribution of the robot system. Okay, next slide. Okay, and here's the bar chart shows the detailed results. Again, you can see a strong effect between no robots and the full payload condition. Okay, next slide. So in terms of conclusion, results from the preliminary study confirmed the feasibility of applying autonomous mobile robots in collaborative warehousing settings to improve human-robot teaming productivity while prioritizing safety and a reasonable increase in human mental workload. And from the overall system-level perspective, the slight human productivity deficit is well compensated by the relative large gain from the robot outputs. And in terms of the limitations, the study was limited by the small sample size, and only male participants were recruited. A larger sample size include both male and female professionals is needed in the future. And efforts are needed to determine which attributes of the robot control the diagram, the speed, or other parameters have a larger influence on human workers during the human-robot collaboration in smart warehouses or other organizational settings. Next slide, please. Okay, acknowledgement. This investigation was made possible by grant from NIOSH ERC, and the content are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent official view of NIOSH. Okay, that's all I have today. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Boy. We appreciate it. We do have a few questions from the audience, so I will ask those here of you. The first question is for Cheryl. So thinking about your research with women farmers, do you think women farmers deal with stress better than male farmers in your study? And if so, why? Is there a hormonal component, or is the most important determinant regardless of sexual social support?
Well, I'm not going to say one is better than the other. I'm definitely not going to say that. What happens is that women are used to multitasking all the time, but there's so many variables that have to do with how people react to stress. It might do with the type of farming or the reason they chose to go into farming. And so there's too many variables that are involved. And that's why I still believe that we've got to do a study where we have women, for example, that are cattle farmers are compared to men who are cattle farmers, so we can compare apples to apples. Definitely there's going to be a hormonal component, or your psychological well-being and your biological makeup in every person when you start comparing the way your body handles stress or reacts to stress. Testosterone tends to make someone more confident, whereas estrogen tends to make people more emotional. And so depending on those levels, age of the person. So there's so many more variables to consider. I will say one thing that we are working on now is women tend to share a lot more than men. And because of the rural male identity, men tend not to seek help for mental well-being, whereas all of the women clearly said they would not hesitate to do that. So some of the projects I'm currently working on are just that, so we can encourage more men to more freely express themselves or to recognize that your mental health is just as important as your physical health. So that's a full question right there.
Yeah, that's something to think about, particularly with perspective as a man. And I wonder about that with the COVID as a backdrop, how with men being a little more reticent to share, and is there some things then going on to balance that with increased self-medication, to deal with issues versus women. I see a variety of areas there you can explore here in the future.
Absolutely. And you've seen liver disease. They're seeing more of that in the hospital now since COVID. I don't know the gender differences, but just where you're stuck at home, and we're seeing a lot more of that. So again, it's just a very full question. I would love to be able to answer it, though.
Let's see. Okay, we have another question. This is for Eric. The person posed that I would think that carrying such a heavy load, firefighters would be protective against osteoarthritis, as previous medical evidence has supported. So what is the difference in this case?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think there's my sports med biomechanist colleagues called I think it's the Goldilocks principle, where there's kind of a fine balance between too little and too much loading. And so the consistent high excessive occupational loading could be that risk factor. So loading is definitely important for the bony tissue. It's the continuous high excessive loading that I think would be that potential risk factor for OA. And you see that in some military populations. And my guess is it would be similar within firefighter as well. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, and so I remember in my research with firefighters, I mean, the weight load they could carry could vary from 50 pounds to over to 100. So there is a lot of give and take there with what you're looking at.
For sure.
Great, thanks, Eric. We have a question for Babak. Question from the audience: how do you ensure that the working conditions or exposures, such as gait and posture, are properly simulated while taking the measurements in the lab?
Yes, I think that's a very good question because it helps, further clarify our approach. If, in terms of looking at the effects of physical exposure by mechanical factors as related to musculoskeletal, disorders, one approach is to just it's just going to be workplace centered, meaning to characterize the influence of that activity on let's say for our case, a spinal load, right? Whereas the approach that we are taking here is more of worker centered. We just get the worker and just characterize the lower back mechanics under a fixed set of tasks and activities, and then see how that how that characterization of lower back is changing for that specific nurse here for our case, with that personal characteristics, physical fitness and so on, and the occupation, how is that going to change over the course of a work day. So if you look at most of biomechanical studies that have been done to evaluate the effect of loading on the lower back and risk of low back pain, they have taken the approach of simulating a work activity in the lab. That's pretty much workplace centered. And we want to avoid that because let's say if a task is designed based on the physical demand of that task on a given worker with given characteristics, then it may not necessarily work for other worker with different characteristics. So designing a task for an average male worker may not work for an older female worker.
Thank you, Babak. Thanks for sharing. We also have a comment/question for Sophie. Great talk. And in my conflict resolution training for veterinarians, I incorporate training in emotional intelligence. And this emotional regulation you're referring to may be beneficial during conflict. Does this refer to the emotional regulation component of emotional intelligence?
Thank you for the comment/question. So it does not refer to the emotion regulation component of emotional intelligence. So there's actually I don't know if I want to call it a debate, but in the industrial organizational psychology literature, a lot of researchers don't like the construct of emotional intelligence because it doesn't predict a lot beyond general intelligence. So generally speaking, in the IO literature, we don't look at emotional intelligence as a construct. So it does not necessarily relate to that. the way I measured it in my study, the good reference is James Gross. His area is on emotion regulation abilities and just in general emotion regulation. He kind of separates, there's multiple types like reappraisal and suppression. In my study, I looked at the person level, so your general abilities. I didn't talk about it today, but I also looked at some emotional labor constructs. So Alicia Grandy is best well known for this, but the constructs of surface acting and deep acting. So surface acting is when you just paste on a happy face. Deep acting is when you try to genuinely feel the emotions you need to show for your work role. So those are sort of the constructs I was focused on, less so on emotional intelligence.
Thank you, Sophie. Question for Boy. In thinking about your work, so looking at robotics, and there's been discussion today earlier with the advent of the pandemic, it's just really accelerated concerns with increased use of robotics. What do you expect to, as far as the mental aspects there that you've looked at, do you expect that to shift to also be looking at the stress or anxiety with job concerns, or how performance is affected in that regard?
Definitely. Actually, some of my research, I collaborate with some economists and on that topic. For sure, in the short term, robotics may replace some work job opportunities from workers, but it will create more as well. So there are some occupations, for example, we are working on remanufacturing and waste recycling. So that is something pretty much an empty area before because of the cost, the risk exposure, but with the collaborative robots we can introduce, we have the potential of increasing the job market and to bring in more workforce. So it's hard to say. And also so for example, previously there are some occupations that are not accessible to people with disability issues, right? And with the robots, we can introduce more work opportunity for them. So it's hard. It is a complex issue, and but I agree. So in the short term, so there are maybe some tasks that will be replaced by robots.
Along those lines, I'll be coming back to all of you to ask a question here in a moment as we think of, again, the COVID-19 backdrop. We can't escape it, right? But Cheryl, there was a follow-up question regarding your work. What were the acreage and farm size of the women farmers in your study? And also, were these livestock operations or crops?
Well, interesting enough, of course, in Kentucky, especially the geographic areas that I looked at, we have 85% of farms in Kentucky are considered small farms, but not based as much on the USDA definition, where a small farm is with a gross cash income of less than $250,000. Oh my, that just makes my heart. But in Kentucky, most of our farms small farms will make less than $10,000 annually. So I don't have the average acreage for the females in this study, but I do know what their crops and livestock were. I had a berry farmer, fruit farmer, goat farmer. I had combination crop and calf cattle operations. So I had quite a variety of women that were in different areas of farming. And I purposely did not include anyone, for example, that did like a wedding venue. That's not farm work. I mean, we're diversifying our farms and maybe do that, but I wanted somebody who actually got out and worked with livestock and or crops in some form or fashion. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Cheryl. That's, it provides a good segue too into the question I was going to ask, which is thinking about additional stressors now on things like, profitability that's already limited for farmers, but thinking about them and others that, many of you are doing work that intersects with essential workers, however we define that, or essential activities, underserved workers, or issues and dimensions that impact them along productivity and advancing technologies or issues around behavioral health, mental health concerns, and how that may increase stress and conflict in the workplace. But I want us to take a step back now. So thinking of the COVID pandemic, but also presenting your research here as a pilot project. And we've got many students here attending the symposium that are watching. And as many of you know, I know that many of you have students that work with you on your research. And when you're doing research, we train students is that, if a human subjects review with IRB is going to take, you say, it's going to take 2 weeks. No, most likely it's going to take a month to 2 months. Or if planning to interview these participants is going to take 2 months. No, it's probably going to take 6 months. But thinking about COVID now, just in about the 5 minutes we have left, if any of you want to share, how has this impacted your research trajectory in working with these populations?
If you don't mind, I can. With farmers, they prefer face-to-face. They want to know they can trust you, and they want to see who you are and what you're about. And the information I need is quite personal. So it has impacted me quite a bit to, I have all kinds of ideas, but who's going to fund a grant where we can't get out? So we've had to try to think out of the box to get some information. But in my population that I work with, again, it's very, very difficult to not do something face-to-face. So it's kind of limited. Lucky enough, I was in the interview stages of this study. And so I could very easily switch in and out with computers or something to that effect. So.
I can jump in there, John. I would say I was looking back when the actual date that I heard that I got the approval for the project was late November, around December. So by the time we really started to ramp up the project is kind of when the pandemic hit. And so we kind of paused a little bit and said, maybe since we're limited with in-person kind of laboratory data collection, maybe use this as an advantage or time to maybe we can include some additional key items in the survey that we were going to send out that addresses some more of the mental health, include some COVID related issues in there as a way we could use that perhaps to inform some future grant applications and projects.
Any other thoughts?
So for our case, it was primarily challenge because we have to put a lot of sensors on our participant. We had it was first of all difficult during the peak of pandemic. Still we are in the peak of pandemic to get individuals consented to come and just spend 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening to be research participant. Beyond that, we had a difficulty from the institution perspective because we are bringing nurses from healthcare facility into the academic side of the campus, inside our department it should individuals in and out were being monitored, that there should be solid reasoning as why you want to bring individuals. We are about to get a start data collection, and we're just implementing a lot of safety precautions added to the work of a student. It's been challenging, but we are trying to overcome those challenges.
I think one of the earlier speakers, and I've mentioned this to one of my other colleagues, that it caused us to move forward very quickly, something we might have been dragging our feet to do as far as technology, and utilizing that more in a way to move forward and think out of the box in our research. So it has forced a hand in that, if you will. I'm old. I don't want to be doing all that stuff, but I did it anyway.
Oh, well, that is a great way to end it, Cheryl, that we think about whether we like it or not, the pandemic has faced not only the face of variety of worker populations, essential or underserved, but also just the nature of the workplace and work in general, the entire enterprise. So it's going to be interesting going forward. Lots of research opportunities for all of us, as well as students that are watching. So I want to thank again our pilot project training awardees for sharing their research, and I wish you the best here in the future. So we're finishing up here about a minute early, so stay tuned. We'll be taking a break here in just a moment, and then we look forward to seeing you back for the poster presentations and breakouts with our exciting research of our students. Take care.